the Demon-Slaying Successor. When Greed Awakens Darkness. In a crumbling ancestral home, an old man named Harold stumbles upon a mysterious black umbrella hidden within the house's rafters during renovations. Desperate for its secrets, Harold's obsession spirals when he realizes the umbrella holds an ominous power beyond his understanding. As strange occurrences plague his nights, a dark past unravels involving the umbrella's connection to a cursed, ancient counterpart hidden in a remote temple. Elsewhere, a sage named Master Bishop senses the umbrella's awakening and races to stop its catastrophic force. As the house becomes a vortex of supernatural terror, wild animals flee, the skies darken, and malevolent spirits emerge, Harold's greed turns to terror. Can Master Bishop save the day? Or will Harold's curiosity unleash an unstoppable ancient evil? Part 1. The Discovery. Harold's hands were rough, weathered by years of toil, but even they trembled slightly as he adjusted his hat under the relentless glare of the afternoon sun. The house loomed before him, a towering, crumbling monument to his lineage. It had stood for generations, handed down like a sacred relic. Its wooden beams, once regal, now sagged under the weight of time. Dust clung to every surface, and whispers of its forgotten secrets seemed to stir with each gust of wind. The workers Harold had hired moved cautiously along the decaying roof, their footsteps creating unsettling groans. "Mind the beams," Harold barked, his voice hoarse but commanding. "They're old but valuable. Don't damage them." A young man, sweat-soaked and exasperated, muttered under his breath. "We're being careful." Old man Harold scowled but said nothing. He had a reputation for being miserly and overly protective of his belongings, but this house's house was different. It was more than wood and nails, it was history, a connection to those who had come before. He couldn't let careless hands erase that. Then came the noise, a loud metallic clang, sharp enough to slice through the afternoon heat. What was that? Harold's voice cracked as he whipped around. "Something stuck up here," a worker called out, leaning over the exposed rafters. "Looks like a bundle of some kind." Of thrill, part dread, part excitement shot through Harold's veins. "Leave it. I'll get it myself." He grabbed the nearest ladder, ignoring the workers' confused looks. At 65, Harold's joints creaked like the old house. But he climbed with a desperate urgency, his fingers tight around each rung. The closer he got to the rafters, the cooler the air seemed to grow. The sun's heat melted away, replaced by an unnatural chill that prickled at his skin. "Where is it?" he rasped. "Right there," the worker pointed hesitantly. Nestled between two rotting beams was a black cloth bundle. It was tightly wrapped, no larger than a walking stick, and coated in decades of dust. Even in the dim light, its fabric seemed darker than shadow itself, absorbing the sunlight that crept through the cracks in the roof. Harold's heart raced as he extended his hand. The cloth felt strange. Not like fabric, but something colder, something alive. For a moment he hesitated, an inexplicable unease gnawing at his gut. "Need a hand?" one worker offered, his voice breaking the silence. "No," Harold snapped. "I've got it." Slowly, he pried the bundle loose, coughing as a cloud of dust exploded around him. The black cloth felt heavier than it should have, and it left a faint, icy sting on his palm. He cradled it close, shielding it from the workers' curious stares. "Back to work," he barked, climbing down as quickly as his old legs could carry him. The moment his feet touched the ground, Harold glanced around, making sure no one was watching. He hurried inside the house, the bundle pressed tightly to his chest. It felt warm now, as if it pulsed softly like a heartbeat. In the kitchen, Harold locked the door and drew the curtain shut, plunging the room into a gloomy half-light. His breath came fast and shallow as he laid the bundle on the scarred wooden table. The silence was deafening, broken only by the soft, rhythmic pounding of his heart. "What are you?" he whispered. The black cloth seemed to beckon him, daring him to look inside. With trembling fingers, Harold began to untie the ancient knots, each pull of the fabric sending shivers up his spine. As the final fold fell away, Harold froze. Inside was an umbrella unlike any he had ever seen. Its handle was carved from something pale and polished, resembling a human bone, smooth and curved unnaturally. The shaft was a glossy black that seemed to consume all light. and its surface bore faint, swirling patterns etched with eerie precision. Harold reached out, drawn to it. The moment his fingertips brushed the handle, a sound filled the room. Whispers. They rose softly at first, like the wind through dry leaves, then grew louder, more insistent. It wasn't one voice but many hissing, murmuring, calling. Harold's hand recoiled as if burned, his breath ragged. What was that he stammered, glancing around the empty room? His eyes darted to the corners, the shadows seeming darker than before, as though something watched him. The whispers faded, leaving an echo in his ears that he couldn't shake. Harold swallowed hard, his mouth dry. It's just an umbrella, he said aloud, as if hearing himself speak would ground him. But even as he stared at it, he knew it was a lie. This was no ordinary object. The air around it felt thick, suffocating, like it carried a weight far older than the house itself. Harold's hands shook as he picked it up again, gripping it tightly as though it might escape. I must be imagining things, he muttered. But deep down, he couldn't ignore the truth clawing at the edges of his mind. The umbrella felt wrong. That night, Harold sat alone in the kitchen long after the sun had set. The black umbrella lay before him like a forbidden relic. Outside, the wind howled unnaturally, rattling the window panes. Somewhere in the distance, a dog let out a mournful howl, and Harold flinched. It's nothing, he whispered, though his voice quivered. Just an old umbrella. But as he sat in the silence, staring at its unholy surface, he thought he heard the whispers again. Softer this time, like voices carried on the wind. He whipped his head around, his pulse hammering in his ears. Nothing. Pull yourself together, Harold growled, though his voice lacked conviction. He snatched the umbrella and shoved it back into the black cloth, tying it shut as if that could silence whatever malevolence lingered within. He stuffed the bundle into a dusty cabinet and slammed the door. His hands wouldn't stop shaking. Later, as Harold lay in bed, sleep refused to come. The house creaked and groaned around him. The sounds too deliberate, too alive. Eleanor, his wife, snored softly beside him, blissfully unaware of the growing dread gnawing at Harold's mind. Suddenly he heard it, a faint scratching noise, like nails dragging across wood. Harold bolted upright, his breath caught in his throat. The sound was coming from downstairs, the kitchen. He glanced at Eleanor, still asleep. Just rats, he whispered shakily, swinging his legs off the bed. His bare feet met the cold floor, and every step down the creaking stairs felt like walking into his own grave. The kitchen was dark, save for the pale glow of moonlight filtering through the curtains. Harold froze. The cabinet door was open. The black cloth lay crumpled on the floor, empty. And standing upright in the center of the kitchen table was the umbrella. Harold staggered back, his chest heaving as a cold sweat broke across his skin. Who's there? He whispered into the shadows. No answer. Only silence. Then, slowly, the handle of the umbrella tilted, as if something unseen had touched it. Harold stumbled backward, his heart pounding so loudly he thought it might burst. The whispers began again, louder now, filling the room, crawling under his skin and burrowing into his mind. He slapped his hands over his ears, but it was no use. Stop it, he screamed. The whispers ceased, leaving only his ragged breathing. The kitchen was silent again. Trembling, Harold crept toward the umbrella. It stood perfectly still, as if it had never moved. This isn't happening, he choked out, his voice hoarse. He grabbed the black cloth, wrapped the umbrella, and shoved it back into the cabinet. His hands fumbled with the lock, and he muttered frantically, "Stay in there. Stay in there." When the lock finally clicked, Harold stumbled back, pressing his back against the wall. His legs gave out and he slid to the floor, his eyes wide with terror as he stared at the locked cabinet. For hours he sat there, too afraid to move. Outside, the wind howled louder, and in the deep shadows of the kitchen, Harold could almost see shapes shifting, twisting like something unseen was waiting. Watching. The umbrella had been hidden for a reason, and now Harold understood why. But it was too late. Something had been awakened. Part 2. The Obsession. The black umbrella sat where Harold had locked it away in the farthest cabinet, behind a stack of old tin boxes and yellowed newspapers. But even though the cabinet was sealed tight, it never felt far enough. Its presence gnawed at Harold's mind like termites chewing through wood, soft and insidious. At first he told himself it was nothing, a trick of the mind, an ordinary object warped by his imagination. Yet as the days crawled on, his conviction withered like dry leaves in winter. He could feel it, its pull stronger than a voice, deeper than instinct. Harold tried to resist, tried to distract himself with work, repairs, and half-hearted conversations with Eleanor. But every time he stepped into the house, the air felt different, like walking into a room where someone was still breathing, unseen. At dinner one night, Eleanor glanced up from her plate, frowning. "You've been quiet lately?" Harold flinched at her voice, his fork clattering against the chipped plate. "Hannah, quiet." Eleanor studied him carefully. Her husband, usually gruff and steady, now looked thin and pale, as if shadows clung to him wherever he went. "You've been acting strange ever since the workers found that old thing in the roof," she said, her tone gentle but firm. "It's just a..." Harold stopped himself. His tongue felt thick, and the lie he'd been about to tell turned to ash in his mouth. He cleared his throat and forced a smile. "It's nothing, Eleanor. Just been tired, that's all." Her brow creased, her worry deepening. "Well, you've been tired enough to wake up pacing around the house at night. I hear you, you know. I called out to you last night, but you didn't answer. You're scaring me, Harold." Harold's spoon froze halfway to his mouth. "I don't know what you're talking about," he muttered, unable to meet her gaze. He didn't remember getting up. He didn't want to remember. That night, Eleanor drifted into sleep easily, but Harold lay awake, his eyes fixed on the ceiling, listening. Outside, the wind hissed through the trees, but inside the house, the silence felt alive. It moved. It breathed. And then it came. A faint noise, just on the edge of hearing soft, rhythmic taps. Harold's pulse quickened as he sat up, his ears straining. The sound echoed faintly through the darkened hallway, like the tip of a cane tapping against the wooden floorboards. Tap. 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 He glanced at Eleanor, who lay undisturbed beside him. Heart pounding, Harold swung his legs off the bed, his feet landing on the cold floor. The taps continued, steady and deliberate, leading him, calling him toward the kitchen. Harold moved in a daze, the house around him warped by shadows that seemed darker than they had any right to be. The hallway stretched longer than he remembered, and every creak of the floorboards under his weight sounded accusatory. When he reached the kitchen, the taps stopped. Silence swallowed the room, heavy and suffocating. Moonlight poured through the window, illuminating the cabinet door where he had hidden the umbrella. It was ajar. Harold's breath caught in his throat. "No," he whispered. He staggered forward, his trembling hands grasping the cabinet handles and yanking the doors wide open. The black cloth lay in the center, but it wasn't still. It pulsed slowly, softly, as though something inside it was breathing. "No," he said again, his voice breaking. "I locked you. I locked you away." The whispers returned, louder now, crawling into his ears like insects. They spoke no language Harold could understand, but the meaning was clear. "Come closer. Come closer." Harold reached for the bundle before he could stop himself, his hands trembling violently. He unraveled the cloth, exposing the umbrella. It lay there, gleaming unnaturally in the faint moonlight, its bone-like handle curved like a talon. "You're just an object," Harold said, hoarsely. "You're nothing," the whispers laughed. Suddenly, the umbrella shifted. Harold gasped, stumbling backward as the handle tilted ever so slightly, as if something unseen had nudged it. His back hit the counter, and his legs gave out beneath him. He sat on the cold floor, panting, his wide eyes fixed on the unmoving umbrella. It didn't move again, but Harold could feel it watching him. The days turned darker. By morning, the house felt alien, even in the daylight. Sunlight slanted through the windows, but it was pale and weak, unable to penetrate the gloom that had taken hold. Harold wandered through the rooms aimlessly, his movements slow and mechanical. Eleanor noticed immediately. "Harold, you're scaring me," she said, gripping his arm tightly as he passed her. "Talk to me." "What's wrong?" "Nothing," Harold mumbled, his voice hollow. He didn't stop to look at her. That night, Harold sat alone in the kitchen again, the black umbrella on the table before him. He stared at it for hours, the house around him quiet except for the occasional creak of the old walls. He couldn't look away, couldn't escape its pull. When Eleanor woke the next morning, she found him still there, gaunt, hollow-eyed, and staring blankly at the umbrella. "Harold," she cried, shaking him roughly. "What's happening to you? What is that thing?" Harold's eyes flickered to her, distant and glazed. "It's mine," he muttered. "Don't touch it. Don't look at it." "It's mine." Eleanor staggered back, tears welling in her eyes. "What's wrong with you? You're not the same man anymore. That thing is doing something to you, Harold. Please, get rid of it." Her words hit him like shards of glass, but he couldn't answer. He couldn't let it go. The animals flee. Over the next few days, something began to happen outside the house. The birds that used to perch on the roof disappeared, their songs replaced by silence. Dogs barked incessantly whenever they passed the yard, their fur bristling with terror. Even the rats that had nested in the basement fled, leaving the house empty of life. Eleanor tried to keep herself busy, ignoring the growing unease that gripped her heart. But one evening, as she scrubbed dishes in the kitchen, she glanced up and froze. Outside, a cat stood on the fence, its back arched and fur standing on end. Its eyes glowed yellow in the fading light, locked onto something inside the house. Eleanor followed its gaze, her heart thundering. It was looking at the kitchen table at the umbrella. "Harold," she screamed, dropping a plate as it shattered across the floor. Harold stormed into the kitchen, his face dark with irritation. "What's wrong now?" Eleanor pointed a shaking finger at the table. "That thing. I don't care what it is, throw it away. It's evil." Harold's expression twisted. He turned toward the umbrella, his jaw tight. "It's mine. It's just a damn umbrella." "Then why is every animal afraid of it? Why does it feel like there's something alive in this house?" Eleanor's voice broke. "I can't do this anymore, Harold. I can't stay here if you won't listen to me." Harold hesitated, pain flickering across his face. He looked at his wife, at her trembling hands, the tears streaming down her face, and for a brief moment, the man he once was broke through. But then the whispers returned. They coiled around him like chains, slithering through his mind. "She doesn't understand. It's yours. Yours." Harold turned back to the umbrella, his expression blank. "Go to bed, Eleanor." "Harold, go." Eleanor stared at him, horrified. Then she turned and fled the room, leaving him alone with the umbrella once more. The growing darkness that night, the house came alive with sounds. The walls creaked and groaned, louder than before. Shadows pooled in the corners, stretching unnaturally across the floors. Upstairs, Eleanor sat curled in bed, clutching a rosary in trembling hands. She could hear Harold's footsteps downstairs, pacing. Harold stood in the dark kitchen, staring at the umbrella. The whispers were louder now, a chorus of voices that never stopped. He could hear them even when he covered his ears. They promised him power, promised him secrets, promised him everything. Harold picked up the umbrella, his grip tightening around the cold, curved handle. For the first time, he noticed something etched into the shaft, tiny symbols, writhing and twisting, as if they were alive. His pulse quickened as the whispers swelled. "Harold!" Eleanor's voice broke through the noise. Harold turned sharply. She stood in the doorway, her face pale and stricken. "Please," she whispered. "Don't do this. That thing will destroy you." For a moment, Harold's hand shook. A tear slipped down Eleanor's cheek, but the umbrella pulsed. Harold's gaze hardened, and his lips curled into a grimace. "Go back to bed, Eleanor." This time, she didn't argue. And as Harold turned back to the umbrella, the last shred of light in the house seemed to fade away. He didn't notice the faint laughter echoing from the shadows, or the way the darkness outside the windows began to move. Part 3. The Awakening. Deep in the forgotten mountains, veiled by centuries of mist, stood the Sanctuary of Balance. It was no ordinary temple. Its walls, carved with ancient symbols, whispered of power that predated memory itself, a power built to keep the world in delicate harmony. At its heart sat Master Bishop, a sage as old as the legends surrounding him, his face etched with wisdom and shadows of burdens carried through generations. Seated in silent meditation beneath a great stone carving of two umbrellas, one light, one dark, Bishop felt the stillness in his very bones. His breathing was slow, measured, as though he were in communion with the earth itself. For decades he had lived in peace, watching over the balance, knowing that evil, though buried, was never truly gone. Then, it came. The first sign was subtle, a slight ripple through the stone floor beneath him, like a heartbeat in the earth. His eyes flickered open, their once soft gaze sharpened with sudden alertness. The ripple grew into a low hum, vibrating through the air, chilling him to the marrow. Master Bishop froze, his senses reaching outward, tracing the source of the disturbance. Slowly, his gaze turned to the carving of the umbrellas. The dark one carved into the stone so many centuries ago was trembling. It was a faint, unnatural vibration, yet Bishop felt it in every fiber of his being. A chill ran down his spine. Noah's voice broke the silence, low and hoarse. He rose to his feet, robes flowing around him like mist rolling down a mountainside. It has awoken. He turned sharply toward the far side of the temple, where a small altar stood against the wall. There, perched on a pedestal of gleaming marble, rested the white umbrella, the temple's most sacred relic. It was pristine, glowing faintly in the darkness, as though aware of what was coming. Bishop approached it with reverence, his footsteps soft against the stone floor. The closer he came, the stronger the vibration grew, now almost a pulse. "You sense it too, don't you?" Bishop murmured, his hand hovering over the handle. For a long moment he hesitated, staring at the white umbrella. To take it meant to leave the safety of the sanctuary and walk straight into the heart of corruption. But he had no choice. Wrapping his hand around the cool, polished handle, he lifted it. The moment he did, the faint glow flared, casting beams of light across the chamber. The trembling beneath his feet stopped. The whispers that had started in his ears fell silent. The darkness seemed to hold its breath. And then it came a voice, hollow and cold, reverberating through the stone. "You cannot stop me again." Keeper Bishop turned sharply, his face hard. "You will not escape," he said, his voice steady. From somewhere unseen, laughter erupted deep and echoing, like the sound of rocks shifting in a forgotten tomb. Shadows coiled at the corners of the room, stretching toward the edges of the light cast by the white umbrella. They hissed and twisted, forming shapes that flickered like smoke. Bishop stepped into the center of the room, raising the white umbrella high. Its light intensified, blasting outward in a surge of brilliance that scattered the shadows to nothing. The laughter ceased. The darkness retreated, but Bishop knew it wasn't gone. The black umbrella had awakened, and it was feeding, growing stronger. Somewhere, someone had disturbed it, and that someone was in terrible danger. Bishop closed his eyes, extending his senses through the thin veil of the unseen world. The vision struck him like a blow. He saw Harold, a frail man hunched in a crumbling kitchen, clutching the black umbrella like a lifeline. Around him, the house shifted and groaned, its walls crawling with shadows that twisted into monstrous shapes. Harold's face was pale, his eyes sunken, haunted, yet unable to look away from the thing in his hands. And the whispers, oh, the whispers. They swirled around Harold, tugging at him, consuming him. Bishop could hear their words, promises of power, secrets, and eternal knowledge. But it was a lie. The black umbrella was not a gift. It was a curse. A vessel of pure corruption. Bishop gasped as the vision ended, his body trembling from the weight of what he had seen. "It has begun," he said to the empty chamber, his voice cracking. "If I do not act, the darkness will consume him." And spread beyond, he moved swiftly, gathering what little he needed: talismans for protection, prayer beads, and small artifacts blessed by generations of sages. The white umbrella hummed in his grip, its light now steady and strong. It knew the fight that lay ahead. Bishop stepped outside the temple. The once serene night sky had turned hostile. The wind had risen, howling like wolves around him. The stars were gone, swallowed by thick, churning clouds. Even the trees seemed to shudder, their branches clawing at the air. The darkness was spreading. "I will come for you," Harold Bishop whispered into the wind. "Hold on." He began his journey down the mountainside, his footsteps swift and sure, despite his age. The white umbrella cut through the unnatural fog that thickened around him, its glow a beacon against the encroaching shadow. He could feel the darkness watching him, following his every step. As he moved deeper into the wilderness, faint sounds began to echo in the distance, cries of animals. Distorted whispers carried on the wind, and the unmistakable feeling of being hunted. Bishop did not falter. Every step brought him closer to the village, closer to Harold, closer to Harold, closer to the black umbrella. Hours passed, but time felt meaningless. The air grew colder. The light of dawn refused to break the horizon, as if the sun itself feared what was to come. Bishop finally reached the edge of Harold's village. The land here was sick, blackened grass, twisted trees, and animals lying motionless in the fields. Ahead, Harold's house loomed like a rotting monument. It pulsed with a faint, inky glow, the windows dark and lifeless. Shadows curled around its edges, clawing at the earth. Master Bishop tightened his grip on the white umbrella, its glow blazing brighter as if preparing for war. "The time has come," he said, his voice low but resolute. The black umbrella waited within, and Bishop would face it no matter the cost. Part 4. The house turns dark. The house groaned. It was a sound Harold could no longer ignore. The ancient wooden beams creaked under some invisible weight, as if the structure itself were resisting, rebelling against its occupant. The air inside felt heavy, oppressive, pressing against Harold's chest like a pair of unseen hands. Outside, the wind screamed against the windows, though there were no clouds, no storm, just a howling emptiness that refused to let go. The animals had long abandoned the property. No birds sang, no crickets chirped. Only silence reigned beyond the walls. But within the house, something lived. At the center of it all was the umbrella. It lay on the kitchen table, its black shaft gleaming under the dim light of the flickering bulb. Harold sat before it, hunched and motionless, his bloodshot eyes locked on its curved, bone-like handle. His breaths were shallow, barely audible, as though he feared the umbrella would hear him. His thoughts raced, each tangled thread leading back to it. The whispers in his mind were growing louder, clearer. They didn't scream, they beckoned soft, persuasive voices promising answers to questions Harold hadn't even thought to ask. "You are chosen. Harold, power awaits those who listen. Do not fear us. We are here for you." The words sent shivers crawling across his skin, yet he could not pull away. He couldn't bear to be apart from it. "Eleanor's breaking point, Harold," the voice shattered the silence. Harold flinched, his wide eyes snapping to the doorway. Eleanor stood there, her nightgown draped loosely around her thin frame, her face pale and hollowed by sleepless nights. She had been watching him for days, watching as he slipped further into some unknown madness. Her voice trembled. "Harold, what are you doing?" Nothing. His voice was hoarse, as though he hadn't spoken in hours. "Go back to bed." Eleanor stepped closer, her eyes darting to the umbrella. She hated it. Hated the way it seemed to pull Harold further and further away from her. "It's that thing, isn't it?" she said softly. "You sit here all night staring at it. You don't eat. You don't sleep. Harold, this isn't you." "It's just an umbrella," Harold muttered, though his voice wavered, betraying his doubt. Eleanor's face crumpled. "No, it isn't. That thing isn't natural, Harold. Can't you see what it's doing to you? To the house? You don't hear it, the creaking, the whispers in the walls. The whole place feels wrong." She moved closer, reaching for him. "Please, Harold. Please." Get rid of it, Harold jerked back suddenly, his chair scraping against the floor. Don't touch it, he barked, his voice louder than he intended. His face twisted into something unfamiliar, something cruel. Eleanor froze, her hand hovering in the air. Harold, he turned away, trembling with anger and something else, fear. You don't understand, he whispered, running a hand through his thinning hair. I can't get rid of it. It's important. Important, Eleanor's voice cracked. More important than us? More important than your own sanity? Look at yourself, Harold. I'm fine, Harold shouted, slamming his hand on the table. The bulb above them flickered violently, buzzing as if the house itself was reacting to his rage. Shadows curled along the walls, twisting into grotesque forms that neither of them could see but felt. The air turned colder. Eleanor staggered back, tears pooling in her eyes. You're not fine, she whispered. You're scaring me, Harold said nothing, his gaze already drifting back to the umbrella as if she wasn't even there. The shadows behind him seemed to grow darker, more pronounced. Eleanor wiped her face with shaking hands, her voice barely a whisper. I can't stay here, Harold. I won't. Harold didn't look up. That night, Eleanor packed a small bag and left the house without another word. She paused at the threshold, one hand on the doorknob, her eyes scanning the dim hallway behind her. It felt like the walls were watching her, like the house itself didn't want her to leave. Please, Harold, she whispered into the darkness. But there was no response, only silence. She stepped outside and hurried into the night, unaware of the eyes watching her through the cracked kitchen window. Back inside, Harold sat alone. The house felt different now, quieter, as though it had claimed some part of Eleanor the moment she crossed the threshold. He should have felt relief, but instead, he felt empty. The whispers didn't leave him alone, though. They were louder now, no longer just in his head. They crawled out of the walls, out of the corners where the light didn't reach. She abandoned you. You don't need her. We are your family now. Harold staggered to his feet, swaying like a man drunk on poison. The floorboards beneath him groaned loudly, as though mocking him for his weakness. He stared at the umbrella, trembling. What do you want? He croaked. The shadows at the edges of the room began to shift. They stretched upward, twisting unnaturally into shapes that looked vaguely human but far from it. Their limbs elongated, their heads misshapen and crooked. Harold blinked rapidly, his heart hammering against his chest. It's not real, he whispered. It's not real, but the figures remained, flickering in and out of existence. Their forms swayed, their dark mouths moving soundlessly, as if they were whispering things too terrible to be heard. Harold stumbled back, his legs hitting the chair. He glanced at the umbrella. It sat motionless, but its surface seemed to ripple like it was breathing. Stop, Harold said weakly, clutching his head. Stop it, the whispers grew louder, overlapping, filling the room like a chorus of damned souls. The shadows closed in, their grotesque faces leaning toward him. Harold fell to his knees, gasping. What do you want from me? He screamed. And then everything stopped. The whispers fell silent. The shadows froze. Harold looked up slowly, his face pale and slick with sweat. The figures melted back into the walls, leaving only darkness behind. The house seemed to sigh, the walls exhaling a low, mournful groan. Harold turned to the umbrella, and for the first time he understood. It was alive. It was watching him. Waiting. The consequence of obsession. Days blurred into nights. Time lost its meaning. Harold barely ate, barely slept. He wandered the house like a ghost, the umbrella always close by. He carried it with him from room to room, never letting it out of his sight. The house decayed around him. The once strong walls began to splinter and crack. The windows grew dark, as though the glass had been stained with shadow. Mold spread along the floorboards, a sickly black rot that crept up the walls like skeletal fingers. One night, Harold awoke to a sound of soft, rhythmic tapping. It echoed through the empty house, bouncing off the walls. Tap, tap. He stumbled to his feet, clutching the umbrella. The sound grew louder, clearer. It was coming from upstairs. Harold climbed the steps, his movements slow and unsteady. The tapping led him to the attic door. The handle was ice cold. He hesitated, his breath catching in his throat. "You're mine now," he whispered to himself. And then he opened the door. The attic was dark, but not empty. Shadows writhed across the floor, slithering toward the center where an old mirror stood. Its glass was cracked and blackened, yet Harold could see himself reflected perfectly. But it wasn't just him. Behind him stood the twisted figures, dozens of them, their dark forms leaning toward him, their mouths open in silent screams. In his reflection, Harold's face twisted, his eyes hollow and empty. The umbrella pulsed in his hand. Harold stared at the mirror, his lips trembling. What have I done? The figures behind him moved closer, their distorted hands reaching for him. The whispers returned, louder than ever, drowning out his thoughts. "You are ours now." Harold dropped to his knees, clutching the umbrella tightly. The house groaned, the walls shaking violently as though they were alive. The darkness swarmed around him, consuming the room, consuming him. "Eleanor," Harold whispered weakly, tears streaming down his face. "Help me," but there was no one left to hear him. The house shook one last time, and then there was silence. In the darkness, the umbrella sat still and silent, its surface gleaming like the void. The whispers echoed softly, fading into nothingness. The house had claimed him. And outside, not even the wind dared to blow. Part 5. The animals flee. The night began like any other in Harold's twisted routine. The darkness outside the house had grown heavier over the days, as though the very air refused to move. Inside, the house sat in oppressive silence, a silence so absolute it felt alive, watching, waiting. Harold sat hunched in his worn armchair, his bony fingers wrapped tightly around a steaming mug of tea that had long gone cold. Across the room, on the kitchen table, lay the black umbrella, its bone-like handle glimmering faintly in the faint yellow light. He couldn't bring himself to put it away anymore. It had to stay close. The thought of it being hidden, of not seeing it, made his chest tighten in panic. It was his. It whispered to him constantly now, its voice more than sound, it was a presence. The murmurs filled the air, no longer just in his mind. Harold wiped the sweat from his brow with a trembling hand. His skin felt clammy, his breathing uneven. The silence was suffocating. Even the creaking of the old house had stopped, as though the building itself was holding its breath. Then, it started. A thump outside. Harold flinched, the sound jolting him out of his trance. He glanced toward the window, where the faint moonlight struggled to break through a thick, swirling fog that had crept in unseen. He squinted, leaning forward. Something was moving beyond the glass. It came again, thump. Thump. Harold rose shakily to his feet, his heart pounding. He stepped toward the window, the floorboards groaning under his weight. "Who's there?" he muttered to no one. Outside, the trees writhed as though caught in a storm. Their twisted branches clawed at the sky, yet there was no wind, just a deep, unnatural howl that seemed to come from nowhere. The fog thickened, obscuring everything beyond the yard. Suddenly, a dark flap broke the silence. Harold jumped back, his eyes widening. A bird, a crow, flew violently past the window, its wings striking the glass with a sickening thud. Another followed, then another. Soon, a swarm of black shapes erupted from the trees, flapping wildly, their cries shrill and desperate. The sound was deafening. "Damn birds," Harold breathed, backing away. His voice shook, but his eyes remained fixed on the chaotic scene outside. It was as if the birds were fleeing something unseen, their panic contagious, their black bodies blotting out the sky. From the distance, a dog's bark erupted sharp, frantic. Then came another. Soon the barking echoed from all around the house, a chorus of terrified howls that sent chills crawling down Harold's spine. "Arf, arf." "Arf, quiet," Harold muttered, though his voice was drowned by the cacophony. The barking grew louder, more desperate. Some of the dogs sounded like they were yelping in pain, their cries cut short abruptly. Then came the wind. It howled through the cracks in the walls and the seams of the windows, a high-pitched, bone-chilling wail. The curtains flapped violently, and Harold's tea mug tumbled to the ground, shattering. Eleanor Harold's voice cracked, though he knew his wife was long gone. The empty house didn't answer him. His attention turned back to the black umbrella. It remained still on the table, its gleaming handle catching the faint light. But something was wrong. Harold's breathing quickened. It was vibrating. The umbrella shook slightly, as if something inside it was struggling to get out. "No," Harold whispered, stumbling backward. "No, no, no." Suddenly, the shaking stopped. The room went deathly still. The wind outside cut off like a blade slicing through fabric, leaving an unnatural, ringing silence. And then, slowly, the umbrella began to rise. Harold watched in horror as the black umbrella lifted from the table, its curved handle pointing skyward, its shaft perfectly straight. It hovered for a moment before tilting forward, then dropped, the pointed tip stabbing into the wooden floor with a sharp crack. It stood there, upright and impossibly still, like it had been planted into the earth itself. Harold gasped, frozen. "What? What is this?" The whispers returned, louder than ever. This time, they didn't just murmur, they screamed. The voices surrounded him, swarming his mind like locusts. "Harold, it's time. Embrace us." The walls of the house shuddered violently. A loud groan echoed through the floorboards, and the furniture trembled. Plates crashed to the ground. The ceiling above Harold creaked and sagged, as though the house itself could no longer bear the weight of what was happening. "Stop!" Harold screamed, clutching his head. The umbrella remained upright, its presence dominating the room. The shadows along the walls thickened and began to move. They writhed, pulling themselves free of the corners, stretching and twisting into grotesque forms, arms, heads, teeth. Harold's breath caught in his throat as the figures surrounded him, their eyes dark and empty. "Stay back," he choked, stumbling toward the door. The house groaned again, the sound so loud it rattled his bones. A sharp crack split through the air, and Harold turned to see the ceiling splintering, long fractures spider webbing out from where the umbrella's tip pierced the floor. Dust rained down, coating his face as he screamed. "What do you want?" The answer came, not in words but in feeling. The umbrella wanted him. Harold's legs gave out, and he fell to the floor. He crawled backward, shaking violently, his wide eyes fixed on the black umbrella. The whispers grew deafening, each one clawing at his sanity. Outside, the dogs had stopped barking. The birds were gone. The wind was silent again. The house shook one final time, and Harold felt it, an ancient, malevolent force pulling at him. The black umbrella pulsed in response, its surface gleaming like a void, drawing him in. "Please," Harold sobbed, his voice broken. "Please. Make it stop." But there was no mercy here. Suddenly, the umbrella shifted. Its pointed tip slowly twisted in the wooden floor, as though it were burrowing deeper into the earth. The cracks in the wall spread wider. The shadows leaned closer. Harold screamed, covering his face as the room filled with a sound that was neither wind nor earth, but something alive, a sound like laughter and growls all at once. And then silence. Harold lay curled on the floor, shaking. When he dared to open his eyes, the room was still. The house had stopped groaning. The shadows were gone. The black umbrella remained standing, upright and unmoved, as if nothing had happened. Its handle gleamed faintly, almost as if it were smiling. Harold crawled forward, tears streaming down his face. He stared at the umbrella, his voice trembling. "What are you?" The whispers, now soft, answered him. "You will know soon enough." The words echoed through his mind like a death knell. Harold sat back against the broken wall, his body shaking, his face streaked with sweat and dust. The house had returned to silence, but its peace was false, hollow, a calm before the final storm. Outside, the land lay still and dead. No wind moved, no animals cried. The village beyond the trees would soon know this silence too. The black umbrella stood waiting, patient as death itself. And Harold, though he did not yet understand, was no longer its owner. He was its prisoner. Part 6. Master Bishop arrives. The air outside Harold's house was still too still. The wind had vanished, leaving behind an unnatural quiet that weighed down the land like a heavy shroud. The trees, once alive with rustling leaves and birdsong, now stood motionless, their skeletal branches clawing at a sky stained an ominous shade of gray. Even the earth beneath seemed to groan in protest, as though something unnatural had rooted itself deep within. A lone figure emerged from the mist, a tall, cloaked man moving with steady purpose. His robes, white yet weathered, flowed around him like a spectral cloud. In his hands he carried an object that seemed to hum with life, a white umbrella, glowing faintly in the dim light, its pristine surface radiant against the gloom. Master Bishop had arrived. His eyes, sharp and aged with wisdom, scanned the surroundings as he approached Harold's house. The moment he laid eyes on it, he stopped. The house. It was no longer a house. It had become something else, something wrong. Its walls seemed to pulse, expanding and contracting as if the structure itself were breathing. Black veins of decay ran through the foundation, twisting up like roots spreading disease. The windows glowed faintly from within, dark and alive, as though unseen eyes were watching. Bishop tightened his grip on the white umbrella, its power responding to his resolve. "It's already begun," he murmured to himself. He stepped closer, his boots crunching against dead leaves and brittle earth. A cold wind stirred suddenly, whispering voices through the cracks of the rotting door. Bishop paused, his gaze steady, his expression solemn. "Harold, you fool inside the house." Harold sat on the floor of the living room, cradling the black umbrella in his trembling hands. The room around him had decayed beyond recognition. The wallpaper hung in shredded strips. The floorboards buckled, crawling with black mold. The shadows in the corners were no longer just shadows, they were moving, writhing slowly, as though they were alive. And yet Harold sat there, whispering to himself, rocking back and forth. He didn't notice the changes anymore. Didn't see the darkness curling around his feet or the faint outlines of skeletal hands reaching toward him from beneath the floor. All he saw was the umbrella. "It's mine," he muttered. His voice cracked and distant. "You belong to me," the whispers swirled around him, cooing in delight. "Yours. Yours." Suddenly there came a loud knock at the door. Harold froze. His eyes, bloodshot and sunken, darted toward the entrance. The knock came again, louder this time, more insistent. He staggered to his feet, clutching the black umbrella. "Who is it?" he barked, though his voice quivered. Outside, Bishop stood firm. "Harold," he called, his voice deep and commanding. "Open the door." Harold's grip tightened. The whispers around him hissed in warning. "Do not let him in. He will take us away." Harold's jaw clenched. "Go away," Harold Bishop shouted again, his voice vibrating with power. "The thing you hold is not yours. Step away from it before it's too late." Harold's expression twisted with rage. "No, it's mine. You can't take it." The whispers cheered, their voices rising in pitch. "Protect us, Harold. We are your only friends now." Bishop sighed heavily. He raised the white umbrella, its glow intensifying. With a single motion, he pointed it toward the door. A beam of white light erupted from its tip, slamming into the wood with a force that shook the entire house. Boom! The door splintered inward, shards flying into the darkness. Bishop stepped through, his presence filling the decaying room like a sudden gust of wind. The white umbrella hummed in his hand, its light driving back the crawling shadows along the walls. Harold staggered back, shielding his eyes. "Get out of my house," he screamed. Bishop's gaze fell on him, on the black umbrella he held so tightly, and his face darkened with understanding. "You've fallen far, Harold," he said quietly. "But it's not too late. Give me the umbrella." Harold clutched the object to his chest like a frightened child. "No," he cried. "It belongs to me. You can't take it away." Bishop took a step forward, his voice soft but firm. "It belongs to no one. That thing you cling to, it's a parasite. It's feeding on you, Harold. Look around you. Look at your home." "Is this what you wanted?" Harold blinked, his eyes darting to the room. For the first time, he truly saw it. The walls were moving, breathing, as though the house itself had become alive. Shadows stretched across the ceiling like spiderwebs, crawling ever closer. "No," he muttered weakly. "No, it's mine. I can fix it, you can't fix it." Harold Bishop's voice grew sharper. "But you can stop it before it takes you completely," Harold screamed in rage, the sound echoing unnaturally through the house. "You're lying. You just want it for yourself." The room trembled. The shadows along the walls lashed out violently, twisting into grotesque figures, faces with hollow eyes, hands with elongated fingers. They screeched as they lunged at Bishop, their wails rattling the windows. Bishop raised the white umbrella, its glow erupting like a star. The light carved through the darkness, forcing the shadows back, but they were relentless. More poured from the walls, pooling like black ink across the floor. Harold Bishop shouted over the chaos. "You have to let it go," but Harold wasn't listening. The whispers in his ears drowned out everything else. They roared like a tempest, filling his mind with promises of power, of immortality, of belonging. "Stop it," he screamed, tears streaming down his face. "Leave me alone." The black umbrella pulsed in his grip, its surface rippling as though something inside it was waking. Bishop's eyes widened. "Harold, no. Too late." "Me." A deafening crack split the air as the black umbrella exploded with power. A shockwave erupted outward, sending Harold crashing into the far wall and knocking Bishop to his knees. The house shook violently, its walls splitting open like wounds. The shadows poured out in torrents, clawing at the air, shrieking in triumph. The ceiling cracked, beams splintering as debris rained down. Bishop struggled to stand, shielding himself with the white umbrella as the dark energy swirled around him like a tornado. At the center of it all, the black umbrella floated upright, suspended in the air. Its curved handle twisted, the shadows converging around it like hungry mouths. Harold lay on the ground, staring up at the chaos he had unleashed. Tears ran down his face as he whispered, "I didn't mean to. I didn't mean to." Bishop fought his way toward him, the white umbrella blazing brighter than ever. "Harold, listen to me," he shouted. "You must reject it. It only has power because you gave it power." Harold's gaze met Bishop's, his face broken and desperate. "How?" "Let it go," Bishop roared. "You must let it go." The black umbrella pulsed, the shadows converging into a single towering mass that loomed above them both. Its shape twisted and shifted, forming a face of gaping mauve darkness, its hollow eyes fixed on Harold. "You are ours now." "No," Harold screamed, forcing himself to his knees. His hands shook as he reached for the black umbrella, his entire body trembling. "I won't let you take me." Bishop extended the white umbrella, its light clashing with the darkness in a blinding explosion. "Now," Harold with a final cry. Harold wrenched his hands away from the black umbrella. The moment his grip broke, the shadows screamed in rage. The black umbrella fell to the ground, its surface shattering like glass. The shadows recoiled, thrashing violently before collapsing into nothingness. The house shuddered one final time, then fell silent. The aftermath. Bishop knelt beside Harold, who lay gasping on the floor, his face pale and streaked with tears. The house, though broken and crumbling, was quiet. The darkness had fled. "You did it," Bishop said softly. "You're free." Harold stared at the shattered remains of the black umbrella, his lips trembling. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen." Bishop placed a hand on his shoulder. "The darkness preys on our weaknesses, Harold. You are not the first, nor will you be the last. But you survived." Harold looked up at him, his voice breaking. "Is it over?" Bishop glanced at the shattered pieces of the black umbrella, his expression grim. For now outside, the wind stirred for the first time in days. Birds began to sing faintly in the distance, as if testing the world to see if it was safe again. Master Bishop rose, the white umbrella glowing faintly in his hand. The balance had been restored, but at a cost. Harold remained on the floor, staring at the spot where the black umbrella had lain, haunted by what he had seen, by what he had almost become. The shadows were gone, but some part of him wondered if they were truly waiting. Just beyond the light. Part 7. The Battle of Light and Darkness. The house was no longer a house. It was a storm, a vortex of shadows and whispers, writhing like a monstrous living thing. The air was thick with dread, vibrating with an energy that was both alive and ancient. The walls, once sturdy, now pulsed as though the very wood had turned to flesh, groaning under the weight of the darkness that had taken hold. Master Bishop stood at the center of the chaos, his feet planted firmly on the cracked floor. His white umbrella glowed with a steady brilliance, a beacon in the storm of shadows. His expression was calm, resolute, though his eyes burned with urgency. Across from him, Harold sat slumped in the corner, clutching the black umbrella as if it were his lifeline. The black umbrella trembled in his hands, its surface rippling like liquid tar. Tendrils of shadow snaked out from its base, curling through the room, twisting across the ceiling like black veins. It pulsed alive, hungry. The whispers were deafening now, overlapping into a chorus of shrill, malevolent voices. "You cannot stop us, we are eternal. We will take him. We will take you all." Bishop's voice cut through the noise like a blade. "Harold, you must let it go." Harold's head jerked up, his face hollow and streaked with tears. His eyes, sunken and ringed with shadow, looked at Bishop with desperation. I can't," he rasped. His voice trembled, barely human. "It won't let me then. I will." Bishop raised the white umbrella above his head. The moment he did, its glow intensified, flooding the room with light. The shadows hissed in agony, recoiling as though burned. A wave of heat and force blasted outward, rattling the windows and shaking the walls. "By the light of balance, I cast you back," Bishop's voice boomed, reverberating through the room. The black umbrella screeched in response. The tendrils of shadow lashed out violently, surging toward Bishop like serpents, their tips splitting into jagged mouths filled with teeth. The first shadow struck, colliding against the white umbrella with a crackling boom. Bishop staggered but held his ground, his knuckles whitening as he tightened his grip. "You will not take him," he roared. The shadows attacked again. Faster this time, wave upon wave of black tendrils snapping at the light. Each impact exploded in a blinding flash, the white energy pushing back against the darkness. But the shadows were relentless, multiplying, spreading like oil across the room. Harold watched helplessly from the corner, his breathing ragged. The black umbrella shook violently in his hands, its whispers now screams. His face contorted with pain as tendrils of shadow began to wrap around him, pulling him into the floor. "Help me," he cried, his voice broken and raw. "I can't." Bishop turned sharply, his gaze falling on Harold. "Fight it, Harold. You must fight it." I can't," Harold sobbed, the shadows tightening their grip. The black umbrella pulsed brighter now, its dark glow radiating a sickly light that seemed to consume everything around it. Bishop's heart pounded. There wasn't much time. The darkness was gaining strength, feeding off Harold's despair, its tendrils crawling across the room like living nightmares. Bishop gritted his teeth and began to chant. "Ancient light, guardian of balance, I summon you. Cleanse this place of shadow. Free this soul from its grasp." The white umbrella flared brighter than before, its light spilling into every corner of the room. The shadows screamed, their wails echoing like the cries of tortured souls. Bishop stepped forward, each step deliberate, as though he were pushing against an unseen force. The darkness fought back. The tendrils lunged at him, wrapping around his legs, his arms clawing at his face. For every beam of light he cast, the shadows struck back, their jagged mouths snapping at the air. The room trembled violently, the walls cracking, splintering under the pressure. And at the center of it all, Harold began to scream. The shadows had him now, their tendrils wrapping around his limbs, pulling him toward the black umbrella. His eyes were wide, unseeing, his mouth open in a soundless wail as the darkness slithered over his skin, creeping into his veins. "Stop it, please," he cried. But the whispers drowned him out. Bishop roared, his voice shaking with fury. "I will not let this darkness take you." He raised the white umbrella high, its glow so intense that it filled the room like a miniature sun. Beams of light shot outward, slicing through the tendrils of shadow, severing them one by one. The shadows writhed and shrieked, retreating briefly before swarming again. Bishop's voice grew louder, his chant rising to a crescendo. By the eternal light of balance, I banish you to the void. Return to the shadows from whence you came. The white umbrella blazed with a final, blinding brilliance. A beam of pure light shot directly at the black umbrella, colliding with it in a deafening explosion. The force rippled outward, blasting Harold backward into the wall and knocking Bishop to the ground. The room filled with light and shadow, twisting together in a furious dance. The black umbrella pulsed violently, cracks spreading across its surface like jagged lightning. The shadows let out a final, desperate shriek as the light overwhelmed them. Now Bishop bellowed, thrusting the white umbrella toward the black one. The light surged unstoppable, unrelenting. The black umbrella shattered. A sound like glass breaking echoed through the house as the dark relic exploded into 1,000 shards, its pieces dissolving into ash midair. The shadows screamed one last time before they evaporated, leaving behind nothing but silence. The aftermath. Harold lay sprawled against the wall, his chest heaving, his face pale and streaked with tears. The black umbrella was gone, its presence erased from existence, but the scars it left behind remained. The room was quiet now, save for the faint crackle of the white umbrella's fading light. Bishop stood in the center of the destruction, his robes torn, his face lined with exhaustion. He looked down at Harold, his voice soft but firm. "It is over." Harold blinked, his eyes red and hollow. I couldn't stop it," he whispered. "It was inside me. I could feel it." Bishop stepped forward, kneeling beside him. "The darkness preys on those who are lost. It promises power but delivers only suffering. You were strong to fight it." Harold shook his head, tears spilling down his face. "I wasn't strong. I let it in. I let it destroy everything." Bishop placed a hand on Harold's shoulder, his touch steady. "You survived. That is strength enough." The house groaned softly around them. No longer alive but broken, like a wounded animal finally at rest. Dust hung in the air, settling over the shattered remnants of furniture and cracked walls. Outside, the first light of dawn broke through the shattered windows, spilling golden warmth into the room. It was as though the sun itself had returned to cleanse the house of its suffering. Harold looked up, his face bathed in the soft light. For the first time in days, he could breathe. The weight of the darkness had lifted, leaving him raw but free. Bishop rose, the white umbrella still glowing faintly in his hand. "The balance has been restored," he said quietly. "But darkness always waits. It will return if invited." Harold nodded weakly, his gaze falling to the floor. "I'll never forget." Bishop gave a faint smile, though his eyes remained sad. "You must not. Sometimes, our greatest battles are with ourselves." He turned and walked toward the door, his steps steady despite the devastation. Outside, the world seemed alive again. Birds chirped faintly in the trees, and a soft breeze rustled through the grass. Harold sat in the silence, staring at the sunlight streaming in. The house was broken, but he was still alive. And for now, that was enough. As Bishop disappeared into the dawn, the echoes of light and shadow faded with him. The battle had been won. But Harold knew that light and darkness were never truly gone. They merely waited for someone to choose. Part 8. The aftermath. The silence that followed was profound. The house, what remained of it, stood in ruins. Where once there had been walls, windows, and doors, now there were jagged holes and fractured beams. Dust hung thick in the air, filtering the pale morning light that streamed through the broken roof. The storm of shadows had passed, leaving behind a stillness that felt fragile, as though the house itself were holding its breath. In the center of the wreckage, Harold lay motionless. His frail form was slumped against the splintered remains of the wall, his clothes torn, his face pale and streaked with soot. A faint rise and fall of his chest was the only indication that life still clung to him. His hands, once locked so fiercely around the black umbrella, were now empty, his fingers slack, trembling slightly even in unconsciousness. The black umbrella was gone. Its destruction had been absolute. Where it had once stood, there was now a dark stain, a scorched mark etched into the wooden floor like a scar. The last remnants of its malevolence lingered there, a faint and ominous echo, but its form, its power was shattered. Across the room, Master Bishop stood tall, though his shoulders sagged with exhaustion. His white umbrella, still glowing faintly, had dimmed now that its task was done. He planted it into the floor beside him, leaning on it for support. His robes were stained with ash and torn at the edges, his face lined with weariness, but his expression remained calm. His eyes, however, told a different story. There was sorrow in them, an unspoken grief that only one who had faced true darkness could know. Bishop let out a long breath, the sound breaking the oppressive silence. He looked around the ruined house, his gaze lingering on Harold's unconscious body. Then, with quiet purpose, he stepped toward him. Outside the house, Eleanor stood anxiously in the front yard, her hands wringing together as she paced back and forth. She had returned at dawn after restless hours spent away, her worry for Harold gnawing at her heart until she couldn't stay away any longer. But when she arrived, she had found the house a ruin of its former self, groaning under its own weight, and the air around it heavy with an unnatural stillness. She had called out for Harold, her voice breaking, but there was no answer. The house, with its broken windows and gaping holes, had only stared back at her, silent and monstrous. Now she stood outside, tears welling in her eyes, terrified of what awaited her inside. When the front door finally creaked open, Eleanor spun around. Master Bishop stepped into the light, the weight of what he had faced etched across his features. He paused for a moment, drawing in the crisp morning air, as though he'd been drowning. Behind him, Eleanor saw the devastation, the broken walls, the wreckage, and her heart leapt into her throat. "Where's Harold?" she demanded, her voice high and panicked. "What happened? Where is he?" Bishop turned his tired eyes to her. "He's alive," he said softly, his voice steady despite his exhaustion. "But he has been through much." Eleanor pushed past him, rushing inside. The moment she stepped through the door, her breath caught. The house she had once called home was unrecognizable. Furniture lay in ruins, splintered beams hung precariously overhead, and the very air seemed heavy, as though still tainted by whatever dark power had passed through it. Then she saw him. "Harold!" Eleanor cried, stumbling toward her husband. She knelt beside him, her hands brushing his face as tears streamed down her cheeks. "Harold, wake up. Please, wake up." Harold stirred at her touch. A low groan escaped his lips, and his eyes fluttered open. For a moment, he looked lost, as though he didn't recognize her or where he was. "Eleanor," his voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. "Yes, Harold, I'm here," she sobbed, pressing her forehead against his. "You're okay. You're going to be okay." Harold blinked, his gaze slowly coming into focus. Then, as memories of the past hours came rushing back, his body tensed. The umbrella he rasped, his voice trembling. "Where is it?" It was here." Bishop stepped forward, his presence filling the room once more. "It is no more," he said gently, his voice firm but comforting. "You are free of it now." Harold turned to look at the man. His eyes, hollow and haunted, searched Bishop's face as though seeking assurance. "It's gone, destroyed," Bishop said with finality. "It will trouble you no longer." Harold let out a shuddering breath and slumped back against the wall. Tears streamed down his face as he whispered, "I'm sorry. I didn't know. I didn't know what it was." Bishop nodded solemnly. "Few do the truth," revealed. Eleanor looked up at Bishop, confusion and desperation in her eyes. "What was it?" she asked softly. "What was that thing? What did it do to him?" Bishop's gaze turned toward the scorched mark on the floor, where the black umbrella had once been. "It was a relic forged in darkness," he said slowly, his voice low and heavy with the weight of history. "Centuries ago, a being of unspeakable evil created it, imbuing it with a fragment of its own power. The black umbrella was no mere object, it was a vessel, a parasite. It fed on weakness, on despair, whispering promises of power and knowledge to those who held it. But those promises were always lies." Harold turned his head toward him, his voice trembling. "It spoke to me. It promised me everything." Bishop nodded. "And in return, it would have taken everything: your mind, your soul, and your life. You would have been consumed, and the darkness would have spread. Eleanor shivered, her hand gripping Harold's tightly. But why did it come here? Why us darkness has no reason, Bishop replied. It seeks where it can feed. Your house became its prison, but it also became its power. When Harold found it, the relic awoke, and it began its work. Eleanor looked at her husband, fresh tears in her eyes. Oh, Harold closed his eyes, shame pooling in his chest like lead. I didn't know, he whispered brokenly. I couldn't stop myself. It wanted me. Bishop placed a firm hand on Harold's shoulder. The darkness preys on those who are lost, Harold. You are not to blame. It whispered to you because it knew your weaknesses, but you still fought back. You survived. Harold opened his eyes, tears slipping down his face. But at what cost? Bishop glanced around the ruined house. The destruction was evident, but the air was lighter now, as though the walls themselves had sighed in relief. The house can be rebuilt, he said softly. And so can you. The light of dawn. Bishop stepped outside, the morning sun rising higher on the horizon. The sky, once gray and ominous, was now streaked with gold and pink, the warmth of dawn breaking through the shadows of the night. Birds chirped faintly in the distance, and a soft breeze rustled through the trees, signs of life returning to a world that had been touched by darkness. Eleanor helped Harold to his feet, his body weak but alive. Together, they stepped outside into the light. Harold squinted against the sun, the warmth on his face a stark contrast to the cold darkness that had held him prisoner. It feels different, Harold murmured, his voice soft with wonder. It is, Bishop said, turning to face them. Darkness does not simply disappear, it must be driven out. And though it lingers in the world, you have chosen the light. That choice will always be yours. Harold looked at the man, his voice shaking. Thank you for saving me, Bishop inclined his head. Remember this, the darkness thrives when we give it power. It waits in shadows, feeding on doubt and fear. But it can always be overcome. He turned to leave, the white umbrella glowing faintly at his side. As he disappeared into the mist, his voice echoed softly in the breeze. Cherish the light, Harold. It is always worth fighting for. Eleanor wrapped her arms around Harold, holding him tightly as the first full rays of sunlight spilled across the land. The house stood broken, scarred, but the air was clear, and life had returned. And though Harold would carry the memory of the darkness forever, he also carried the light, fragile, precious, and unbreakable. For now, that was enough. Part 9. A warning and redemption. The first light of dawn bathed the broken house in hues of gold and pink, its warmth filtering through shattered windows and holes in the ceiling. The once suffocating air felt lighter now, as if the darkness had been exhaled into the void. The house was still broken, its walls cracked, and its floor stained with the remnants of a nightmare, but it was quiet. For the first time in days, there was peace. Harold and Eleanor stood just outside the front door, their feet sinking into the dew-soaked grass. The earth, which had felt dead and barren before, was alive again. A faint breeze rustled through the trees, carrying with it the chirps of sparrows and the calls of distant crows. Sunlight spilled across the yard, a stark contrast to the lifeless shadow that had once shrouded the house. Master Bishop stood before them, his white umbrella glowing faintly in his hand, though its light had dimmed now that the battle was over. His robes hung in tatters, streaked with dirt and ash, but his presence remained steady and unshakable, a pillar of calm in the aftermath of chaos. Harold's face was pale and gaunt, his shoulders slumped, his eyes red from tears that had long since dried. Beside him, Eleanor gripped his arm tightly, as though afraid that letting go would make him slip away again. They stared at the man who had saved them, gratitude mingled with a lingering, unspoken fear. Bishop's gaze swept over them both, his expression solemn. The danger is gone, he said softly, his voice carrying an air of finality. But you must remember what brought it here. Harold flinched slightly, lowering his head. The words cut deeper than any physical wound, for he already knew. It was his greed, his insatiable curiosity, that had awakened the black umbrella and invited the darkness into their home. The weight of that knowledge pressed down on him like a stone. Darkness's cunning bishop continued, his tone heavy with warning. It does not force its way in. It waits for an invitation, sometimes through greed, sometimes through fear, but always through weakness. It is patient, Harold, and it knows where to find those who will listen. Harold swallowed hard, his voice trembling as he spoke. I didn't mean for any of this to happen, I know, Bishop replied gently, though his expression remained stern. But meaning well does not erase consequence. The black umbrella was a vessel, a trap disguised as a gift. It promised you everything, and it would have taken everything in return. That is the nature of darkness. It offers what you desire most, but asks a price you cannot pay. Harold nodded slowly, guilt tightening in his chest. I thought it was something valuable. I didn't know what it was capable of. Eleanor turned to Bishop, her voice soft and pleading. Is it truly gone? Bishop's eyes darkened slightly, his gaze drifting toward the house as though searching for something unseen. The black umbrella has been destroyed, its form shattered, and its power driven back. But darkness is never truly gone. Harold's head shot up, fear flickering in his eyes. What do you mean? Bishop looked at him, his voice low and steady. It waits, Harold. It waits in places unseen, where greed and despair take root. You cannot destroy it completely, because it lives in the hearts of men and their choices. But it can be resisted. It can be defeated so long as you choose the light. Eleanor clutched Harold's arm tighter, her face pale. And us. What do we do now? Bishop softened slightly, his voice taking on a kinder tone. Rebuild your home. Rebuild your lives. But remember what happened here. Let it remind you of the cost of curiosity unchecked, of desires untempered. Do not let shadows into your hearts again, for once invited, they will never truly leave. Harold's throat tightened, his gaze drifting back to the house. The structure looked as though it might collapse under its own weight, the scars of the battle still etched into its walls. Yet something about it felt lighter. The oppressive dread had lifted, replaced with a stillness that Harold hadn't felt in years. But even now, as the wind stirred the leaves, he could swear he heard it, the whispers. Faint and distant, like echoes of a nightmare half remembered. He shook his head violently, forcing the thought away. Eleanor turned to Harold, brushing his shoulder gently. We'll fix it, she said, her voice trembling but determined. We'll make it a home again, Harold nodded, though his heart remained heavy. I hope so. The departure. Master Bishop took a step back, his white umbrella glowing faintly in the rising sun. The light framed him like a halo, his figure bathed in gold as though the earth itself bowed to his departure. He glanced once more at Harold and Eleanor, his eyes holding a weight that went beyond words. Your lives have been spared, he said softly. Cherish them. And never forget light and darkness are choices. You must always choose the light. With that, Bishop turned and began walking away, his footsteps silent against the soft earth. Harold and Eleanor watched him go, their eyes following his figure as it melted into the rising mist. The glow of the white umbrella lingered for a moment longer, a final beacon, before vanishing completely. Eleanor exhaled shakily, her shoulders sagging with exhaustion. He's gone, Harold nodded, his gaze still fixed on the horizon. But his warning isn't the haunting echo. Over the following days, Harold and Eleanor began the slow work of rebuilding. The broken beams were cleared away, the shattered glass replaced, though the scars on the floors and walls remained a stark reminder of what had happened. Harold refused to erase them entirely. They need to stay, he said when Eleanor asked. So we never forget. As the days turned to weeks, the house began to heal. Birds returned to the trees, their songs filling the mornings with a fragile beauty. The grass, once blackened and lifeless, turned green again, reaching toward the sunlight. The house, though still bearing its wounds, no longer felt oppressive. But Harold could not heal as quickly as the house. At night, when the world was quiet and Eleanor slept soundly beside him, Harold lay awake, staring into the darkness. The whispers, though faint and fleeting, seemed to return with the silence. They were not clear anymore, not the cruel voices of the Black Umbrella, but echoes, murmurs on the edge of hearing. Sometimes he heard his name. Sometimes he heard nothing but a soft, mocking laugh. One night, Harold stood by the window, staring out into the moonlit yard. The wind stirred the branches of the trees, and he shivered despite the warmth of the room. For a moment, he thought he saw a shadow move near the tree line, just a flicker of black against the pale grass. His heart raced and he turned away quickly, forcing himself to breathe. "It's gone," he whispered to himself. It's gone, but deep down he wondered. Redemption and resolve. Days turned into months. Harold worked tirelessly to repair the damage, pouring himself into each nail hammered, each board replaced. He spoke little, though Eleanor often saw him staring at the marks left behind, his face somber. One afternoon, as they sat on the porch together, Eleanor placed her hand on his. "We're safe now, Harold." "It's over." Harold looked at her, his gaze softening, though the shadows under his eyes remained. "I know," he said quietly. "But I need to remember. If I forget, if I let my guard down, it might come back. Or worse, it might find someone else." Eleanor nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "We'll remember together." Harold squeezed her hand. "I'll never let it happen again." As the sun dipped below the horizon, the sky painted in shades of crimson and gold, Harold sat back and listened. The wind rustled through the trees, and for once there were no whispers, only the gentle hum of nature returning to life. For now the shadows were gone. But as Master Bishop had warned, darkness was never truly destroyed. It lingered, waiting, in forgotten places and quiet corners of the world, biding its time. Harold knew that, and he would spend the rest of his days ensuring that when the whispers came again, he would not listen. Not this time. Not ever again.